Hello and welcome to Psych319, Chapter 6, Part 1. Today we're going to talk about long-term memory. I want to start off with how we retrieve long-term memories. Um, you might remember we have the simplified model of memory about what goes on. You have perceptual memories, um, which are the quick, short representations of sensory stimuli, and that exists because we have receptors out in the periphery that store information for a brief moment that allows us with attention to convert these into short-term memory stores where we rehearse things, and then those are allowed, with enough rehearsal, those are allowed to be converted into long-term memories. So the difference between long-term memory and the other types of memory is that long-term memory appears to store almost an unlimited amount of information for an unlimited amount of time. We have about 1 billion neurons in our brain, and each one of those neurons makes roughly 1,000 connections with other neurons, which means we have about 1 trillion connections in our brain. That's 1 trillion bits of information that can be represented. So we have a very massive computer in our head in a very, very small space. And most of us can remember all the way back to childhood, very, very early memories. As early around 4 or 5 years of age is typical. Very traumatic memories, be earlier than that, can be remembered. But usually we don't memorize stuff from childhood because the brain is actually learning how to learn. So the hardware for memorizing is not fully developed, and therefore uh, we don't need to memorize content knowledge. We're learning things like processes, how to walk, and so on and so forth. So babies tend not to remember stuff for that reason. And then why do we forget? We're going to cover that a bit more later on. But we forget by two processes, the process of decay and interference, and I'll get into those. We talked a little bit about them in short-term memory. We'll talk about it a little bit more in this chapter. So just to refresh your memory on the short-term memory model, there is also the working memory model, where short-term memory is represented here in this middle column as a series of multiple processes um, that can happen at the same time. The visual spatial scratch pad, which is used for retaining visual information, um, and then the phonological loop, which is used for auditory information. So if you're trying to memorize a phone number, you're probably using the phonological loop, where you're auditorially repeating the phone number in your head again and again and again. And the visual spatial scratch pad might be useful for maybe visualizing, I don't know, maybe a map from how to get to one part of the city to another. And all of those depend upon how much attentional resources you have available, which is indicated by this central executive here. If you've gotten enough sleep and you maybe had your coffee and you're alert, you're able to distribute short-term memory across most resources. If you have that, if you have good short-term memory, then you're allowed to convert those things into long-term memory. One last moment, I also remember that these arrows go both ways for two reasons, because when you're retrieving things from long-term memory, those go first into short-term memory. They enter your consciousness, and then you're able to act upon whatever information is in short-term memory. Um, so how do we forget? So I want you to try and remember some of the first things. The first time you were injured, if you can remember what that was like. Maybe your first pair of pants, if you remember. The first music maybe you bought yourself with your own money. Your first crush. So some of these, you can remember certain elements of these events, even though you haven't remembered them for a while. And think about what elements you remember and what ones you don't remember. Um, Chances are you tend to remember the more emotionally significant or biologically relevant details of those memories. Like you might not remember the pair of pants, but you might maybe remember an episode or something very strong that happened to you when you were wearing a particular pair of pants. And they might not have been your first ones, but it might have been the first thing to jump into your mind. And you might not remember all the details of how you were, maybe the first music you purchased yourself might have been important. There's a sense of autonomy there, but it might have been very easy to remember the first time you were injured seriously, because that's something that is very significant to you as an individual, so you're likely to hold on to that memory. So we can remember something for a lifetime, it seems, and even if we're exposed to it once. Um, so it seems like the idea of decay theory can't account for all forgetting. So decay theory says that if you don't rehearse something, you won't remember it. And that's true. But there might be things in your life that you remember from childhood that you've only rehearsed a couple of times, and then I ask you about them, like your first pair of pants, and you might not have forgot them you might not have been able to remember them for really like long period of time. Sorry, you have not thought about them for a long period of time, but the memory is still there. So decay theory doesn't seem to account for all forgetting. There must be other reasons why we forget. And that goes back to the theory of interference, which we've already talked about in the last lecture. So I'm going to bring up this chart because it makes it a little clear of the difference between proactive and retroactive interference. So let's say we have these memories that we've had for a really long time over here at the left, and then we've recently learned a new memory that we're trying to hold onto for a while, and then somebody introduces some new information, even more recent information. Um, and interference means that these new memories interfere with each other, or they interfere with older memories that we've had. So proactive interference is when old memories interfere with our ability to memorize new things, and that's indicated here in green. So it might be harder to remember the fifth person you've met named Jennifer at a party after you've met 4 other Jennifers. It might be hard to remember her name um, because you've had so much recent information that might interfere with that new information. Vice versa, it might be the opposite. You might get retroactive interference. Maybe you like the new Jennifer, and she starts to erase the recent memories of recent Jennifers that you've met, and that would be retroactive interference, when new memories interfere with our ability to retain information we've already learned. So I want you to think of the first person named Abraham that you've learned about. Okay. You probably thought of Abraham Lincoln. Most students do. And there's a pretty darn good reason for that. There's not too many Abrahams walking around the streets of New York. It's not a very common name. So who was the first person named John you learned about? And now that might be a little harder because we run into so many Johns in the world, particularly in North America. Um, and so as a result, you have a lot of interference going on. There are many, many Johns in your lifetime, and there's only one Abraham in most people's lives. So too much interference in the second task. And this is what we talk about when we talk about encoding specificity. We'll get more into this later, but the idea that the name Abraham is uniquely linked with Lincoln for most people. So why bother forgetting? Well, it's very useful to forget because we don't need to know all the Johns that were not important to us. We only need to know the relevant Johns. There are many, many Johns in the world. Just like you see many faces on the train, you don't need to remember all those faces, so it pays to forget the ones that you don't think are going to be relevant to you in the future. So this is a forgetting curve. We'll show a couple of these. If we ask you to memorize a bunch of stuff, some of the things you'll forget almost immediately in a matter of minutes, like what's outside your window right now, hopefully not what I'm saying, and then sometimes things take hours or days to forget. Things that are important tend to be remembered for a really long time, sometimes forever. Here's some more detail on this curve. So the curve was discovered by Ebbinghaus, and he got up every day and he memorized a bunch of arbitrary letter strings. And then he tested himself every day, and it turned out that some of the letter strings he could, most of the stuff he forgot really, really quickly. But some of the things he would end up storing for a really, really long time. And it's a very small amount, a very small percentage that he could remember over a long period of time. But it seemed that if he had enough time to rehearse some of the letter strings, or maybe they made words that made sense to him, then he was allowed to retain that information. So there's evidence of long-term memory. And Ebbinghaus, of course, did this a long time ago, so it's kind of the earliest evidence we have of long-term memory. So then why, again, do we forget? If we can store all this information, why would we even bother to forget stuff? Well, while it appears that a trillion bits of information is quite a bit, it's not an unlimited capacity. A lot of those neurons are dedicated to other functions, like breathing and heart rate. So there's far more and in addition to that, there's also far more information in the world that we can remember. There's so much information going by in just a minute or an hour, in terms of your visual system, all the stuff that you have to process. So it's a lot of details. We don't want to remember everything. So forgetting is a process of weakening neural connections that we don't use so we can strengthen the connections we do use. Anytime you learn something and then practice that, you're reinforcing a neural connection in your brain. By not rehearsing it, that connection gets weaker and you're allowed to forget it. So we forget to minimize interference. We only hope to remember the things that are relevant to us, and by intentionally forgetting things, by not rehearsing them, that minimizes the amount of data that we don't care about in our brains. So errors in retrieval are also linked to errors in encoding. Encoding, again, remember, is the storage of memory traces. The type of error you make indicates where coding may have malfunctioned. For example, most errors made in short-term memory tasks are acoustic. So sometimes when somebody's trying to memorize a list of words, they might make acoustic-based errors like phone sounds like bone. So they might actually remember phone being part of a long list of words as opposed to bone because they just sound alike. But errors in long-term memory are semantic-based, meaning they're surrounded they have to do with the meanings of words rather than the sounds. So in a long list of words, somebody in a long-term memory task might mistake nurse as being on the list rather than doctor if it were on the list. And doctor, of course, sounds nothing like nurse, but they're very closely related. And this gives us a clue as to how these individual processes are working. So it appears that short-term memory is very auditorially based. And that resonates with the phonemic loop that we talked about earlier. When we're memorizing stuff, we rehearse it in our heads. It's as though we were speaking to ourselves. But once stuff has been memorized, we start to closely associate with the meaning, the semantic meaning of that word. And so things tend to be, or appear to be, stored with their meaning or their relationship to us as individuals. And that basically says what I just spoke about. So I'm going to take a quick break here, and we'll begin with remembering in the next section.